Welcome to the Flyboy Podcast, where we bring you just one thing, cool flying stories. I'm your host, David Moore, and today I'll be talking with Thad Darger. Thad has nearly 3,000 flight hours in the B-1, the T-38, and the F-117 stealth fighter. He received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his combat flying over Serbia in 1999. He's flown for the Air Force, for United Airlines, and just last October he started flying the Gulfstream GV, Gulf Victor. He and his wife Danielle have been married for 35 years and they have 4 children. And interestingly, their oldest daughter is currently a major in the Air Force, and she flew C-17s as part of the evacuation effort from Afghanistan. Today, both Thad and his daughter fly the same airplane, the Gulfstream. I should also add that Thad was one of the very first people I met when I arrived at Holloman Air Force Base in 1997 to start flying the F-117. So Thad, welcome to the Flyboy Podcast. Let's dive right in.
Thank you.
Tell us about your first solo in the Black Jet.
Yeah, I think it's always remarkable. You know this as well as anyone does. You know, the F-117 is very specific, especially in Air Force circles, right? Because we don't have a 2-seat version of the airplane. And so whenever anybody asks me about my first solo or my first flight and anything, it's pretty ironic to think about what we did in the F-117 because of the fact that the first time you take off, you're in the airplane by yourself. There isn't a second person, obviously, that's helping you. And so I just remember after months of training and being in the simulator and going over different procedures, pulling out of the runway that first time, and when the gear came off the runway, it was surreal. It just didn't feel like other airplanes had flown that I'd flown in the past, just because of the fact that there I was on my first flight by myself. And so obviously something very specific, the A-10 obviously, as well as the stealth fighter, but it made that a really memorable first flight for sure.
Indeed. And I think on our first flight, we had an instructor pilot flying in a chase pickup in a T-38, and they would come zooming in. They would take off first, and then they would swing around and pull up on our wing right as we got airborne, which was another fun experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Thad, let me ask you this. What's the longest sortie you've ever flown?
Another great question. I actually just looked something up before we joined this call. I looked up Lindbergh's first flight across the Atlantic, right? It was something like 33 hours that he flew in that airplane. But I had a very specific situation when we deployed our jets to Aviano to start Operation Allied Force. We took off obviously, and I was in the first force ship, and we flew nonstop from Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico all the way to northern Italy. And for a single seat fighter, I don't know if this is true or not, and I don't like to use a lot of superlatives, but it has to be in the top 1/10 of 1% of single seat Air Force flights, because that flight was a 13.9. Wow. I used to quote it as a 13.7 until I looked at my logbook recently, but almost 14 hours strapped into the airplane, refueling with no stops. And over the years when people ask me what that's like, I say, well, just go to your kitchen table and sit down in like an oak chair, put on a dry suit, not a wet suit, right? Something that's trapping in moisture, the suits that we wore in case we had to get out over the North Atlantic, and then sit at your kitchen table for 14 hours. And just to make it a little bit more exciting, refuel in the dark 7 or 8 times over the North Atlantic. So 13.9 hours for me. And ironically, another thing that I just looked up was my longest flight that I ever had was in a B-1 from South Dakota to Guam. It was 15.3 hours, but a completely different situation, right? I could get up out of my seat. I was in the airplane with another pilot and 2 navigators. But 13.9 hours, as you well know, is a very long time to sit in a single-seat fighter.
Yeah, you got me beat. My flight to Spangdahlem was 12.1 or 12.2, something like that.
There you go.
So that's a long sortie.
13.9. I always tell people it was fun to do it once, but if you ask me to do it again, especially today, I think I would take a pass.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned the B-1 and that long sortie. Can you give us a sense? What was it like? The difference between flying the two airplanes. How did they handle differently? Which one did you like more, and why?
Yeah, I don't think that it's hard. You know, the three different airplanes that you mentioned that I flew while I was on active duty, the B-1 and the T-38, and then the stealth fighter. You know, it was wild because they all flew the same ground track in the pattern. And, you know, most people aren't aware of the fact that a B-1 back in the day, we used to, you know, pull a closed pattern, stay really tight to the runway and everything. And the ground track that we flew was the exact same ground track that a T-38 or a stealth fighter would fly. And so when I talk about the differences in the handling or the flying of the airplanes, I don't think that they're that much different. You know, I've seen some of my counterparts like you that came from other fighters, that came from A-10s or F-16s or F-15s, you know, talking about how underpowered the stealth fighter was. And of course, you know, with non-afterburning engines and wings that were swept back at 67.5 degrees, no flaps, you know, we would have to go so fast, and our takeoff and our landing rolls would be so long. But once we were in the air, I'm one of those guys, maybe I've just forgotten what it was like, but I always say they didn't handle that much different. You know, I enjoyed all three of them. I really did.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So let me ask you, assuming the statute of limitations has run out, was there ever a time you may have broken the rules to either fly a little too low or buzz somebody's house or fly some place you weren't supposed to?
I don't know if you would call it breaking the rules, but I have a very specific memory of when I was flying an air show in the 117, and we were at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, and I had taken off, and I was supposed to fly by at a couple of other air shows, and so I went to meet a tanker, and the tanker was actually going the wrong way in the air refueling track, and so by the time I caught up to the tanker and I ended up getting my gas, I didn't have enough time or enough gas because of the opposite direction to go where I was supposed to be going. So I went back to Whiteman, and I had this, you know, full F-117, meaning full of gas. And I called the air boss and said, you know, what do you want me to do? And he said, well, the Thunderbirds are getting ready to fly, and so I either need you to land, you know, immediately, or I need you to go away for like an hour and a half and then come back. And I chose to go away. And I flew down to the Lake of the Ozarks, and I was VFR. It was the middle of the summer, obviously, right? I'm doing an air show. Yeah. And I ended up just buzzing boats in a stealth fighter at like 500 feet off the water. And if people would wave at me, then I would stop, and I would spin around in a circle and wave back at them and everything else. I don't know if I technically broke the rules when I was doing that.
Nope. That doesn't sound like breaking the rules to me. That sounds to me like initiative and, you know, a responsible use of, you know, time and, you know, you wouldn't want to land heavyweight and potentially, you know, get hot brakes or something like that and then mess up the Thunderbird's takeoff. So, no, sounds like good judgment to me.
I was there for an air show, so I needed to let the U.S. population see that airplane. And so I did it for an hour at 500 feet over the Lake of the Ozarks. And it was just really memorable because it was beautiful out. It was, you know, an hour of just seeing things and not flying under, you know, instrument flight rules, obviously IFR, just flying VFR and kind of burning up that time. And so, I did that one. Should I say another one, or should we move on?
Well, I just want to say that may have been the single greatest recruiting event for the Air Force of that year. Yes. So if you have another one you'd like to share, absolutely.
Well, I'll share another quick one. So when I was in every aircraft I flew, we always had T-38s. So on the B-1, we had T-38s to build up our flight time as co-pilots. It's called ACE, Accelerated Co-Pilot Enrichment. Yep. And I have an identical twin brother, and at the time when I was in South Dakota, he lived in Kansas City. And so I used to take a T-38, I'd call him up and I'd say, hey, I'm going to land at Richards Gebaur in Kansas City, and let's go out and do lunch. We'd go out and do lunch, right? Typical training flight in the Air Force. And then after lunch, he'd just take me back to the airport, I'd get in the T-38, and I'd fly from Kansas City back to South Dakota. Well, I had done that over the course of the 4 or 5 years that I was in South Dakota quite a few times as my training. And And one of the last times when I was there, I told my brother, I said, hey, I know what direction we're taking off. Go park your car at the end of the runway and then, outside on a regular street and I'll fly right over the top of you. Well, the runway at Richards-Gebaur had a little bit of a hill in the middle of it. It wasn't completely flat. And so when I took off, I pulled my gear up and I just kind of leveled this T-38 off. I won't even say now how high I was. I wasn't very high. And I couldn't see this car. And all of a sudden I'm looking and I'm accelerating. I'm in full afterburner in this T-38. And all of a sudden I see his car. And when I see his car, he's sitting on the top of his car. He has a sunroof open and he's sitting there. And when I flew over the top of him, I looked back into the cockpit and I was going like 380 knots or something. And so I just pulled the jet straight up just to kill all the airspeed, right? Because we weren't supposed to be going over 300 knots below 10,000 feet. And when I got back to Ellsworth, I called my brother, and my brother said, that's the coolest thing I've ever seen in my life. I mean, I almost did one of those Maverick movie things where I kind of dusted him off as I went over the top, but none of it was planned. I was just looking for him, and I couldn't see him because of the runway. So I was waiting to get a phone call after that one because that had actually been cleared really high, so it was okay for me just to kind of pull it up. But going 380 plus knots right off the top of the runway there was probably not the smartest thing that I've ever done in my life.
I think you were wise to work expeditiously to get your airspeed under control.
Got to bleed it off.
That's right.
That's right.
So tell us about flying in combat. Do you have a particular
combat,
sortie you think back on that you reflect on?
Yeah. Well, I know this is a podcast, so I don't want to make this super long. That jet I flew for 13.9 hours was 806, the only stealth fighter that's ever been shot down. I was in that first four ship. We landed in Aviano, and my wife was about 7 months pregnant at the time, and she was having a kidney complication. And I had flown back to the States. Luckily, that resolved itself, believe it or not, on my way home. And so I was at home when the stealth fighter was shot down on that fifth night, 806. And when the 9th Fighter Squadron, our sister squadron, deployed, I volunteered to go back. And I went back, and I think I flew on the first night after it had been shot down, because if I'm not mistaken, there were 4, 5, 6, even more days where the weather was bad, and I don't think the jets went into country. But I had a lot of things going through my mind. I mean, I had, my wife at home with 2 daughters, and, everybody in the military, or a lot of people do this, right? My wife was 7 months pregnant. This stealth fighter had been shot down, and so I tell people all the time, we never said it was invincible, right? It's low observable. And so to go out and fly on that first night, there were a lot of thoughts that were going through my head. But I think, like all of us back then, we trusted the technology. We trusted the science. And I don't want to say that I was scared. I'm more than happy to say at different times in my life when I have been scared. But we didn't know what to expect, and it was I was very apprehensive at the time. And I went out and I flew that first mission. I'll never forget the 2 targets that I had. The first one was a bridge. The second one was a very tall communications tower. And I flew that first night and then got into the rhythm just like everybody else. And it was for all of us, I think, right? We had been practicing, so to speak, our craft and what we did, and sometimes I relate it to sports, right? Going out and practicing for a football game all the time and never getting to play a game. And not that this was a game, it was life and death, but I felt so prepared, just like all of us did. The radio calls seemed like everything we heard and we practiced, and it ended up being the next, whatever it was, 45 days of flying those sorties, and something I'll obviously never forget.
Indeed. Yeah. So when did you know you first wanted to be a pilot?
One of my favorite questions that people ask me all the time. So my dad was a Marine Corps helicopter pilot. He flew CH-46s in Vietnam. In fact, he was shot down 3 times, survived.
Wow.
And so when I was growing up, my dad was in sales, which is ironic because I ended up doing that for a little while. And, I used to see my dad's shadow box sitting on the wall in his office, just like I'm assuming you're sitting in your office or I'm sitting in mine, and I would see my dad's shadow box. And I used to watch these A7s that were in the Guard way back then in Sioux Falls, South Dakota for the South Dakota National Guard when I would be, sitting in a junior high school history class. And I always thought it was cool. The concept was cool. And, when I had the opportunity to go to the Air Force Academy, even when I showed up, I met a lot of people. And the reason I like this question is because it seems like I've met a lot of people that are like, when I was 5 years old, I knew I wanted to fly an F-15. And, and I'm like, I was never really like that. I'd never flown an airplane until I flew T-41s and gliders at the Academy. And so it was something that kind of, I guess, grew on me. While I was there and while I was at the Academy, I was like, this would be a really cool career. And I can sincerely say, sitting here at the age of 58 years old, that it's really the only job that I've ever had, being a military pilot, where I felt like I was really doing something to help other people. And that goes back to, I've met people from Kosovo since we were there. And when they find out that that's what I did, they're so thankful. And I wasn't a person that started off, even when I was 18 or 19 years old. I wasn't like, oh, I'm going to go do this and I'm going to fly that. It was just something that kind of evolved in me. And I'm glad it evolved the way it did, because I loved every minute of it, and I love what I'm doing today.
Yeah. Of course, one of the realities, of course, is that it is a dangerous job, and I think all of us have lost friends along the way. Tell me about the aviators you've lost and who they were.
Sure. Well, like you said, it's when I talk to people on airliners, they talk about how scared they might be at different times about flying, and we all know that civil aviation is extremely safe, right? We quote all the time that it's safer than going out driving in your car. Military flying is obviously very, very different, and because of the things that we have to do, we train at different levels, and we put ourselves in situations that can sometimes be dangerous. One of the people that I lost is a really good friend of mine. His name was Paul Ziemba. We were on the parachuting team together at the Air Force Academy. He was a year younger than I was, and we were very dear friends. He was actually in my wedding. And Paul ended up getting a B1 a year after I received my B1 out of pilot training, and he was a B1 pilot down at Dias. And I'll never forget coming in one night, or one morning, to our squadron in South Dakota, and somebody saying, hey, did you hear about the B1 that went down last night? And ironically, I think two C-141s had actually hit each other over Montana the same night. And so the Air Force had 3 accidents in the same night. But when we found out that it was a Dias airplane, the first thing I did in my squadron was I picked up the phone, right, this pre-cell phone, and I called Paul's number at his house, because it was like 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning, and I said, hey, Paul, I heard about what happened with one of the jets down at Dias, give me a call. And about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, no names had been released, and somebody in my squadron said, hey, I saw the names, and the names were very unusual. And the minute I heard that, it gave me goosebumps on the back of my neck. It ended up being, the aircraft commander's name was Zenon Gok. I think it was spelled G-O-K. And then, of course, my dear friend Paul Ziemba, that was the co-pilot on that flight. And they were out flying night low level, B-1s, 0.9 Mach, 500 feet off the ground in the dark. And they're not sure exactly what happened, but they had some kind of a malfunction or a fly up. And from what they know, they leveled off below their MSA, their min safe altitude that we were always supposed to climb to, that was on all of our charts. And they ended up impacting a sheer cliff out in western South Dakota. And you take essentially a 400,000 pound empty B-1, meaning it probably weighed more than that. And the largest part of the airplane they found was a foot by a foot. And so, those tragedies, they happen, they occur. Sent a lot of ripples through all my friends. We had these members of the parachuting team and everything else. We were a very tight-knit group of people, and we ended up going back to the academy where he was buried. for his funeral. And yeah, it speaks to what I said at the beginning, right? It's a sometimes a very dangerous business, what we do. And rightfully so, meaning we need to train like that, right? To be able to do the things that we need to do in combat. But yeah, that was probably the one that hit me the hardest, because that was pretty early on in my career when we lost him and his three counterparts in that accident in West Texas.
Wow.
Yeah. Tough.
It's good to remember him.
It is.
Yeah. Yep. Talking about some of those hazards, I was going to ask you if there had ever been a time when you'd had a near miss in an airplane, and I realized I remember it. I was there the night you told us in the squadron.
Yeah.
It was in an F-117.
Yep.
And I believe it was you and another pilot on the same route.
It was.
Tell us what happened that night.
That was one of the scariest things that's ever happened to me. And, I've had a couple other ones. We had some kind of, we had one of the Air Forces there. We were in some kind of an exercise. And we were in northern New Mexico, right on the border of Colorado. And we were flying, and what was happening is we were all going in just like we always flew, right? We were in a line. We were essentially 10 minutes apart from each other, and we were going in and doing what we did on a normal training mission, simulating these attacks. And I've thought about this. I don't want to say I think about it every day. I don't, but I've thought about it over the last 25 years. And what happened was, when I came into this military operating area, this MOA, I descended immediately to my attack altitude. And unbeknownst to me, this other pilot that you just mentioned was, for some reason, 20 or 30 minutes late. I think it was a maintenance problem, or there was a tanker problem or something. And I am on this attack to get graded, right, for this Air Force inspection, Air Force-wide inspection or whatever. And I'm looking down, and as I'm concentrating on the target, I see some lights going as fast as anything I've ever seen in my life go from right to left. And when I glance up, I hit some jet wash, and it completely knocked off my entire autopilot. And I then ended up missing the target, ironically. And unbeknownst to me, that other pilot, when he passed 90 degrees perpendicular to me, he just started climbing out like that thing I talked about that I'd done with my brother. And then Denver ended up diverting a civilian airliner. As soon as I came out of the MOA, I received the proverbial, hey, we have a number for you to copy down. And I copied the number down, and then I went back, and of course I had to explain to our leadership, people like you, what had happened. And ironically, even today, I don't know how he ended up 90 degrees out. I need to take some accountability for it, because I think I had descended that 1,000 feet, before I had been cleared to do that. But yeah, I tell people all the time, based on the movement, the jet wash, and the fact that my entire autopilot got kicked off, I don't know if we passed 20 feet away from each other. I don't know if we passed 2 feet away from each other. But it really took my breath away.
Yeah.
It goes back to that other conversation that we were just having about that B-1 that went down in West Texas. I mean, that was, to the best of my knowledge, as close as I ever came to another airplane in the air in an unplanned way. And it was terrifying after it happened. After I got myself back together and I was like, wow, I just missed this target, so now I screwed this up for the thing. Yeah. And then when I started thinking about how close we had come to each other, it was tough. That was one of the scariest things, if not the scariest thing that happened to me while I was in the Air Force.
Have you ever come close to ejecting?
No. I will say that the thought crossed my mind for a split second when I was in the T-38 landing in the snow in Grand Junction, Colorado. And the only reason that it popped into my mind, I don't know if you've ever been to Grand Junction. Yeah. Grand Junction kind of is it's almost like Aspen. It's a one way in, one way out with bluffs all around it. And so we were really low on gas I was with a really good friend of mine. This is again when I was at Ellsworth, and when we flew down to minimums and then broke out and landed the airplane, I don't think I had verbalized it, but in my head I had thought, if this doesn't work, right, because the T-38 doesn't carry any gas, if we weren't going to be able to get in, we didn't have an option to go somewhere else.
Wow.
But it was just a momentary thought that went through my mind, when you're 27 years old, where I was like, is this really what's going to happen now? I'm not going to be able to land this airplane, and then I'm going to have to eject because I don't have another option. But that was probably the only time that it ever crossed my mind.
The only time that ever happened to me where I was like, seriously, is it time to go for the handles, was in the A-10, coming off a low-angle strafe pass.
Yep.
You do a quick pull up and away,
Yep.
and all of a sudden I heard this loud bang.
Oh.
And I heard a radio call, two's on fire, or two's trailing smoke.
Oh.
And I looked down and I saw the temp on the right engine spiking through 1,000 degrees centigrade.
Oh.
And I said, okay, and I'm about 100 feet over the ground out in the Arizona desert. And I thought, is it time? Is it time to go?
Right.
It's like, nope, the other engine's still flying, still turning. I'm still flying.
Right.
Pulled back the engine, the right engine, shut it down, landed on one engine at Gila Bend. But for that moment, it was like that. I was surprised how quickly the thought materialized and said, it's like an option. It's just part of your checklist.
Right.
If this happens, is it time to go? And actually, I remember we used to talk about making the ejection decision before you step to fly, and I think that was a sort of a classic example of that.
Ejection's never been on my to-do list. I mean, I'm already an inch shorter than I was back in my 20s and my 30s, and I don't want to be another inch shorter. But no, that was. I don't think any of us have that on our to-do list. That's a tough thing to have to go through for sure.
Yeah. So let me ask just a couple more questions. What sortie has given you the greatest sense of accomplishment after you completed the mission?
Yeah, it would probably be that first flight in combat, right? Because of all those other things that were going on. Both my targets, right? Because we used to do intel, and I actually had somebody fly over my first target and look at it after I'd attacked it, and they took a picture of it. They brought it back to intel. But from a satisfaction level or from a memory standpoint, that's probably the one. Just because of, like I said, all of those other things that were going through my head, and for the ability for us as a weapons platform. To then go out and continue doing what we were supposed to be doing for the next 70 some odd days, right? After that first shoot down on night 5 was quite the accomplishment. So I would probably say that first combat sortie.
Yeah. I think the whole campaign was 78 days, as I recall.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, when you talk to young people who say they're interested in learning to fly,
right,
what advice do you give them?
I tell them that if it's something that they're interested in, they should pursue it. I think that the idea of becoming a pilot seems so daunting, right? Unless you have somebody else in your family that's done it. When people think about their training or what they need to know, or especially when people talk about going into the military, right? People always bring up their vision or all of these other things. And it just seems so difficult for people. And what I always tell people is, if it's something that you're interested in, you should 100% pursue it. I will never forget, when I was getting ready to go to the academy, I thought about not going. And one of my dad's best friends, another CH-46 pilot in Vietnam, said to me, Thad, you have an opportunity to do something that most people aren't afforded. They're not given that opportunity. And so whether you think you want to do it or not, you have to go try it, because you might love it and it might be the best thing you've ever done. And I call Al Davis every once in a while and tell him thank you for pushing me in the right direction. And the reason that I share that story is I had a similar conversation with my daughter. So when my daughter was graduating from Air Force, she was like, I don't know if I want to go to pilot training. I don't know if I want to go through that and commit to it. And I said, Alex, you have the opportunity to do it, meaning she was physically qualified and she had a pilot training slot. And I said, you really need, of course, we don't want to pressure our kids, and I've never done that with any of mine. But I needed to lay it out for her the same way Al Davis had laid it out for me, 30 years earlier, and say, look, you have an opportunity to do something. You should go pursue it and see if it's something that you might really excel at and might really love. And so whenever anybody asks me about becoming a pilot, it might sound a little bit canned, but I'm like, you need to do really well in school, right? If you're going to go a military route or whatever. And, you just need to make sure that you're a well-rounded person that can go out and pursue that kind of a dream. And so, yeah, I encourage people whenever they ask me to do it. I've never been the guy, and I was never like this with my kids. I was like, you can't do that, so just cut it. I'm always like, go for it. It's a really, really cool experience. And so that's kind of how I handle it.
Indeed. And you said her name is Alice?
Alex.
Yep. All right. I have a favor to ask. I'd like you to talk to Alice and tell her that she needs to come on the Flyboy Podcast.
Oh, I bet she would do it in a heartbeat.
Excellent.
You talked at the beginning, and I'm sorry, I will deviate for just a short second. My daughter, when I think she was either 27 or maybe she had just turned 28, she had become an aircraft commander in the C-17. And when the thing happened in Afghanistan, when everything kind of broke down there at the end, she was tasked with flying some things in, dropping them off. She had 2 brand new co-pilots with her. She had, a very, very small number of hours in the left seat. And when she left from Tacoma, they didn't even give her a contingency briefing about if something were to happen, because they said, you're too young, your co-pilots are too young. If things get crazy, you're not going in there. She goes in the night before, drops off 3 helicopters, flies over to Qatar, and wakes up the next morning to a phone call, hey, we need you to go back. And so, in my business career, I've always told people, there are people in the military, not just in the Air Force, that are in the military that have more responsibility when they're 24, 25, 27 years old than most people in business will ever have in their lives. And most people don't understand that. And it goes back to how hard we train across every branch of the military, how good our technology is, how good the support is from the American people and our government to make us who we are. But it's pretty remarkable that she had that opportunity and she took it. And she flew in there and took a whole bunch of people in to help stabilize the airport. She took in like 120 guys from the 101st or something to help stabilize it. And then she took out some of the people in the U.S. Embassy. She had a completely loaded jet, and she was actually the jet that took off before the one with all the people hanging on it, where they fell off. She was the aircraft right in front of that.
Wow.
So yeah, she's special, and she's done some incredible things, and like many of us, she's done some of those things at what a lot of people would consider a very young age. But yeah, she's done some really good stuff.
Amazing. Amazing, and as they say, a chip off the old block.
Oh, I don't take credit for that. She's much better than I'll ever be.
Well, Thad, thank you for joining us today. You've been listening to the Flyboy Podcast. This podcast is brought to you by our parent organization, the Flyboy Lab. The mission of the Flyboy Lab is to elevate awareness and appreciation of aviators, their service, sacrifices, and contributions, and hopefully we've fulfilled that mission today. New episodes of the Flyboy Podcast drop every Thursday morning, and you can find previous episodes on our website, theflyboypodcast.com. Until our next sortie, push the Mach, use the vertical, and fly safe.